Okay, I think we're live. Good morning, everyone. It's always glad to be with you guys. Even though it's close to the holiday, it's nice that we can be here at preschool. But today we're going to discuss the crisis of Biden and the crisis of the Democratic Party. And then after we begin with that discussion carrying from last week, we'll give updates on our upcoming event. Our next event for the year, James Baldwin, should be in August. And so we'll update on planning around that. But without further ado, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Tony Montero, to begin the discussion.
Thank you, Emily Dawn. But so nice to be here to see everybody. Everyone is knowledgeable, aware of the crisis of the Biden administration and of the Democratic Party's campaign to reelect him. And it is a crisis of unusual, in fact, unique dimensions and characteristics. Nothing like this has ever been seen in American politics. A lot of that has to do with the fact that the media is such a huge part of American politics, and this has never been the case. This is probably more so the case than in any other country. And so you get a 2-year campaign, which we're into, and it is dominated by the media, which of course elevates personalities rather than programs or the plight of the people and so on. So it's very personality, very media, very celebrity driven. Hence, when Biden performed as he did, I think it was June 27th, it takes on a more, it magnifies the crisis of the individual, of the person that's running for president. And 50 million people looked at it on the night of the debate. I think they say another 20 or 30 million people looked at it on various forms of social media. So everybody saw it. Everybody saw that he was in profound and rapid cognitive decline. It looked like everything from Alzheimer's to Parkinson's. Some people say he was given the wrong drugs or too much drugs and things didn't go well. But at any rate, we saw the collapse of the presidency and of a candidacy, and it has collapsed. He will not be the nominee. The big question is how they transition from him to whoever else comes after him. But it is huge. I was re-listening to his interview last night with George Stephanopoulos. And besides everything that went on there, I detected a certain logic in a certain case that he was making for himself. When Stephanopoulos asked him, has he had a neurological test? And he says, I have a neurological test every day because I am running the world. That was the case for his presidency, while he listed these domestic legislative achievements. It is, I am the only hope for American domination. And my neurological test is that every day I run the world. And that is the dilemma of the ruling class. If the neoliberals and neocons that are all mainly assembled in the Democratic Party, but they're also in the Republican Party. But the spearhead of the whole war policy, as we've seen over the last 3.5 years, is the Democratic Party. You just cannot deny it, nor can people who say they are fighting for social justice at the same time say, I'm voting for Biden because Trump is a fascist. You know what I'm saying? Let me put it another way, more concretely. I have many friends in the Black political class and the Blackness leadership class here in Philadelphia. And one who is a good friend and is the minister of Mother Bethel AME Church. And back in January, I think the AME Church as a denomination came out with a very scathing attack upon the Israelis for the genocide they were carrying out in Gaza. In fact, I think they also criticized the Biden administration. But then they pivot in the last maybe month and a half to endorsing Biden. So, and they say we're endorsing Biden because Black folk have a domestic interest in voting rights, police reform. Biden has brought down inflation. Black unemployment is at a lower level than ever. Black participation in the labor force is higher than white participation in the labor force. And the only thing that we're left with is, where are you getting these statistics from? This is not the life that people live. In fact, I would argue, and there's a opinion piece in the New York Times today that kind of confirms this, that for most Americans, that is to say, not just a slim majority, but upwards of 70% of Americans, America is a dark and tragic landscape with no way out. For most Americans, just to say those words is deeply troubling and emotional, because in the first instance, we're talking about children who have been abandoned by a society where profit and greed and war are priorities. That is why the logic of what Biden, in his demented state, argued, that I am running the world, and I run this world with or without the American people and over their broken and dying bodies. That's what he's saying. But they've kind of been saying this to us for some time, that the mass of white working people are deplorables, that they are racist, that they are Nazi-like or fascist supporting. All of that. They're discrediting of the history of the United States. And here's where I'd like to just make a point. There are all kinds of histories, there are all kinds of interpretations of history. But the best histories of the United States are, like Howard's in, a people's history of the United States. What have the people done? What have the people made in this history? So to argue, that, the American Revolution was a counter-revolution, and then after you say that, okay, the rest is, excuse the pun, the rest is history. because they began as a counter-revolutionary group and they've not changed, and thus now what is a growing multi-generational, multi-racial, what else? Did I say multi-gendered coalition that will elect Trump. All of them are fascist. The black people are fascist and don't know it. The white people are fascist and know it. You know, I mean, the historians that articulate that give history a bad name, and it's already kind of in the gutter the way it's been used. But I say all of that to say, to argue that the people don't count, that the ruling class is not driven by internal contradictions that we see on full display. That just because they are the ruling class doesn't mean they can rule. That can be taken away with a heartbeat. And so the people are making themselves heard in ways that the ruling class would prefer not not to hear or to see. For example, and this is such an astounding statistic. And this was in the New York Times Siena poll about 3 weeks ago, a month ago. You know, where they were showing where Biden and Trump stood in the horse race. And by the way, the polls have gotten worse for Biden over the last week or so. But in that poll, I would call it a survey more, 70% of the people said the system either had to be changed or torn down. But that didn't tell us everything. As devastating as that is for the ruling class, 55% said the system has to be significantly changed. That is, they said the political and economic system. 15% said the entire system had to be brought down. Yeah. Now, you can go back to the activist 60s, the anti-war, the Black Power movements, the Black Panthers, all of that. Nothing ever approached this. 15%, I don't know what that, maybe somebody can do the math, what that is in actual numbers. On a population of 330 people, 15% is what? I turn to the physicist. 45 million Americans say the system should be torn down. Now, it is upon that eruption, that earthquake, that all of this is going on among elites. So the most important thing, as far as I'm concerned, is not what elites are doing, because let's just say Biden is kicked to the curb, Kamala Harris becomes the candidate. Let's say she wins, which I don't think she can. Let's say she wins. Fundamentally, nothing changes. Nothing fundamentally changes. The trajectory of the people's anger and their separation from the ruling class, and this sense by 45 million people. And then if you take the other 55%, which is what does that add up to, if you don't mind?
170 million.
170 million. Okay, 170 million say the system, political economic systems, should be significantly changed. Okay? Now that's the election base that we go into this election with. A dissatisfied and angry electorate who might elect Trump, and I think that's a greater possibility, or let us say they elect Kamala Harris. Do you think either of them winning is going to change the dissatisfaction and anger of the people? They will probably go through this episode with Biden and his mental breakdowns. They might come out of that even more convinced that the system must be fundamentally changed or torn down. This meets, I think, the requirement of what, again, Antonio Gramsci. Sometimes I feel like I'm always doing the same narrative in free school, but forgive me if I am. But it gives further meaning to Antonio Gramsci's notion of an interregnum. And I think that is a very valuable concept. Interregnum means a period between two other periods. Okay? It is a period of transition. And that's why he precedes the talk of interregnum with the idea the old is dying. So the interregnum is between the old and the new. This is an interregnum. Political fluidity, ideological fluidity, requiring new theory and better theory. And here I disagree with many of my young colleagues. There is no going back to a previous period. Because the previous period, part of what I lived through, but I'm talking about the previous period, a generation or two before me, was nothing like this one. What do you mean? In terms of the people's anger. It is so deep, so wide, so profound that we have perhaps never seen anything like this. We're 70% of a population. And this is, by the way, this is the value of modern social science, modern polling and surveying, and so, with all of the inadequacies of it. It's a tool that no group of revolutionaries have ever had at their disposal. So, if you go back in the days, let us say, of the Chinese Revolution, of Russian Revolution, it was more theory than actual empirical evidence. They presumed that the people would act in a certain way, but there was not a lot of evidence. Today, we have so much evidence of a people in distress, but a people who are angry and will not be ruled in the old way. That is what we are experiencing. On top of it, and this is Richard Haas. Remember his, as he left the Council on Foreign Relations, he made in the interview in the New York Times, he said that the greatest national security threat to the United States is not Russia or China or Iran. It is the American people. We just can't forget that. And he was accurate. He saw, well, I think a lot of people see it, but he was willing to publicly state it. that the American people's wish for peace is a national security threat. Well, it makes all the sense in the world. They executed the Rosenbergs to quiet peace demands. They locked up Du Bois and Ropes and Wentz and many, many others to quell the peace struggle.
Yeah.
It's arguable that John F. Kennedy was assassinated because he was seen as an obstacle to the war and hegemonic ambitions of the military industrial complex and the U.S. ruling class at that time. There is no question in my mind that Martin Luther King was assassinated precisely because he was seen as a national security threat. And it was not the act of a single shooter. So Richard Haas is saying what is true. But if it were true back in the 60s, it's way more true today, far truer today, because the American people are more clear about war and peace and the fact that they don't want war. We've often said it is an anti-war sentiment rather than a peace sentiment. I'm a little, I don't know. It might be a peace sentiment. There may have been enough experiences of the American people, and great experiences of a people, of a nation, get not only passed on through narrative, but somehow they become a part of the cultural, political DNA of that nation. And people are acting on impulses that they don't even know where they're coming from. When they say we don't want war no more, we've had enough of that. So much so that there is no serious political base or support, I should say, for funding the war in Ukraine, and hardly any for funding Israel's genocide in Gaza. The pro-power, and Samir knows this better than anyone. He and his colleagues work tirelessly to educate the people about the Palestinian cause, often at great sacrifice to themselves, And sometimes it felt that we weren't making any headway, like we were beating our heads up against stone walls. But suddenly, something happens. People saw what all of our words couldn't say, couldn't tell them. They saw Israel using American weapons, carry out a genocide, and that was it. So they're literally saying, thank you, Samir, for your work. One of those unnamed freedom fighters. And that's what the freedom struggle is made up of anyway. Most people are unnamed, and they're the ones that make the difference. But suddenly it breaks in 100 campuses. And what Richard Haas said, the greatest national security threat is domestic. And these young students were treated like King, like John F. Kennedy, like others, as a national security threat. You don't treat peaceful demonstrators the way they were treated unless you see them as a national security threat. It's kind of breathtaking, to tell you the truth, very emotional. But while the students may not have been able to fully see it, they were not alone. Because, churches, black churches, white denominations, and so on, were expressing the same things. Of course, those tied most securely to the Democratic Party, like the labor leaders. And this, we have to come back to this. What is the role of trade union bureaucrats in smothering the aspirations of working people for their own interests? So they made, meaningless little statements about we're against what's going on in Gaza, that type of thing. They didn't mean it, and they weren't going to carry through in action to do anything. So the whole AFL-CIO, the United Automobile Workers Union, they just all went for Biden. So you see, this is becoming a geography created by people whose only concerns are their self-interest. So they're going to play politics with the people at a time when the people are not having it anymore. We've seen it in Philadelphia, and we've talked about this so much in the free school, where black folk just don't vote no more. I'm talking about registered voters. And you get wards and voting districts in the city where as low as 3% of registered voters even turn out, et cetera. You know what I'm saying? So here we have then an interregnum, a crisis of legitimacy, and that word doesn't begin to describe what we're looking at. This is a crisis of legitimacy, I guess the mother of all crises of legitimacy, in this period of transition, which leaves, and we don't know which of these will be the final path, but several paths, either civil war or something like it, revolution, pre-revolution, a combination of the two, this option that Marx and Engels talked about, the ruin of all classes, which means the collapse of society, the ungovernability of society, or a longer than any of us would hope for transition, which can be quite painful, more painful than what exists right now. Now, this is from the standpoint of the masses of people, not from the elites. The elites are in trouble. We know that. They have, frankly, it shows that they don't think well. They don't have a theory that explains the moment. They don't have it. Their worldview is been proven inadequate. Their worldview, which says that American hegemony is the best thing that ever happened for the world. Now, if you think Biden is delusional, people who repeat that are even more delusional than he is. I mean, China, Russia, North Korea, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, Syria, China. I mean, add on to that BRICS, 30 nations waiting at the door. Let us in, let us in. We're trying to escape this bullshit, So BRICS, 11 BRICS nations plus 30 more, that's 41 nations and growing every day. The Shanghai Cooperation Organization. I mean, a lot is going on. And you want to talk about make America powerful and great again? Are you on the pipe? Well, they did find vials of cocaine in the West Wing. So, so somebody is snorting or smoking. And, I won't get into the other illegal drugs that are probably being passed around. But it's all good. You know what I'm saying? If it's good enough for Kensington, it's good enough for the White House. So let everybody get down.
No, thank you.
There's a song, it's time to get down, down, down. So I said, but anyway, a worldview that no longer explains anything, theories that no longer explain anything, and politicians that can only play it by ear. Now, just my lesson about theory. Theories are useful, and all theories are not useful. All theorizing is not useful. Everybody that theorizes is not, doing anything productive. However, good theory is indispensable at a time of crisis like this. And so there must be a theory, even if it does not find immediate popularity, a theory which helps to explain not only this moment, but the path forward. Okay? Here in Free School, we've talked about Du Bois Lenin synthesis. And, the way we talk about it is that in this moment, the more dynamic side of the thesis, antithesis, is Du Bois. And this is Jeremiah's thing that I'm always thinking about. Because at one point, we referred to Du Bois as the special theory. Now, I had made a mistake in trying to, compare it to Einstein's general and special. The general was his initial theory, and what we call the theory of relativity is the special theory of relativity. But at any rate, and this is, going back and forth talking with Jeremiah, is it possible for special theory to become the general theory? A theory that grows out of the explanation of a part of the overall landscape, could that explain more than the theory that preceded it? And I think that Du Bois does. Now, then we come up to James Baldwin and Emily, and how Emily argues that Baldwin is indispensable, and even in a Du Bois Baldwin, how do we think? Complementarity. Even in a Du Bois Baldwin complementarity, Emily argues that the creative side is Baldwin. That Baldwin is more, I won't say useful, but Du Bois brings something so unusual to the explanation of the American people. And his work is a study of the American people in the most profound and depth way. And Emily says that she articulates Baldwin as a theorist of crisis. And I would say
That comes from you, actually.
I think it comes from you. Even, okay. Well, okay. A theorist, and specifically a theorist of this crisis, and a theorist of this crisis of the American people. And when I talk to Emily, I often say recently that, I'm being more convinced of you, of what you're saying. It's making more sense to me. I'm seeing and I'm feeling what you're saying. But at any rate, however we configure all of this, it is a need for more theory, for better theory, to think anew about what the American people are capable of in a time like this. And don't think the people will not respond and don't know that a theory, a way to explain this, and narratives of this crisis that address their problems, their impoverishment, their anger, and I think even more, Baldwin's A New People, The Last White Nation, Achieving Our Nation, undoing what has been done over 300 years, undoing the identities that have emerged and have historically constituted part of the American people. And then on the other side, a theory of social systems. But, you know, because we think the way we think doesn't mean that we have crossed every T and dotted every I. But there must be a framework of thought that is rooted in the crisis and the American people. We can't just act like 70% of the American people ain't said that they believe the system should be changed. You know, I mean, who can believe Gerald Horne any longer? Even with all of the misquotes and every flaw in his book, The Counter Revolution. But looking at this, how do you explain this? What do you say? If 15% of the American people say the system needs to be torn down, are you going to say, oh, that's all black folk? No, it's not all black folk. It's black and white people and Latinos and Asians. Okay, so let me just kind of end here. You, Biden is going to be pulled. They can't go with him. I mean, when a guy starts saying he's the first black woman to be vice president, I mean, you're dealing with a cat that's completely thrown off. You don't know what's going to come out of his mouth. And when he has this exaggerated sense of himself, I'm running the world. Hometown, give me a break. I mean, even if you thought that in a delusional moment, there's a better way to put it so you don't make a fool of yourself. So they have to pull him. The donors are pulling back. The more Democrats are going to come out. The people who are hardcore with him are going to be with him. But at the end of the day, there will be somebody else. How they will choose someone else, I don't know. Kamala Harris from 2020 shows she's not a really competent politician in the bourgeois sense for this time. And her term as vice president was restricted and so on because Biden
Yeah, I don't know. I just feel like it's very striking that this is also coming out in the New York Times because, like the Times, other kind of like kind of mainstream media outlets have been very quickly turning on Biden at the same time. And I think part of it, from my sense of, especially after the debate with Trump, it's that if you look at the media as part of kind of the overall apparatus of the state, part of what the state, and this is what Raju also brought up in his presentation at the Science Symposium, but part of what the state is very concerned with is, the modes of ideological reproduction, but especially in a more concrete way, like also for those of us who have like worked in like PR, like marketing, like those fields, it's kind of like perception management, narrative management, narrative control. And I think part of what broke, especially for the media after the Biden-Trump debate, was they could no longer maintain a certain illusion of competence, of governance. And I think it was almost like a curtain was being ripped out before the American people, and they were able to see not just Biden, but a completely like decrepit, completely failed, like total political class, like a total like ruling class. And I think that's part of the reason why, in particular, the media, which is basically the arm of the part of the state which is the most concerned with, like protecting like the ideology of the system, why they because Biden represents, like for them, a crack in basically their kind of interest of maintaining like narrative hegemony, perception hegemony amongst the American people, which I mean, the people already didn't really believe, I think, the media anyways, but I think it became so pronounced and so at the forefront of people's consciousness. I think that like I think that's part of the reason why the media has been in some ways at the vanguard of the push to oust Biden. But I don't know. Yeah, that's just what I was thinking about. I don't know if there are more from the Warren cast.
Well, just that I also think that in the media, it's not like everybody is explicitly every day getting up briefs like you need to defend Biden. Like I feel like the whole point of the media is that actually like it's self-maintained. Like you individually are actually very invested. You can buy the basically you're used to saying. And I feel like it's interesting. It's been interesting seeing sort of the crisis play out for people where they're like basically confessional saying like, oh, like I really believe that it had to be Biden. Like I really thought like, we need to defeat Trump, but like I just can't take it anymore. Like they're basically documenting even their own like sense. And I feel like that also shows like, I guess the falling apart is very consolidated, like really, where I feel like it is kind of like an echo chamber where you believe something and then you self-fulfill or like self-act out something like of your own like agency, like you're actually just invested in it. But I feel like that coalition or that consolidation is also falling apart, where people have to make like their own judgment calls. Yeah. Yeah, it's really also like a little tangential before I go to the main point, but like in response to the media, I was also looking at what the Russian media and Chinese media were saying about the debate. And in China, well, both of them obviously focused on, they compared the level of politics, public, because like America has, it's like what you start out with, that in America, politics on a public stage are personality driven. Rather than ideas driven, like rather than, let's say, the way Putin presents himself or Xi Jinping presents himself, like the type of politics done on the public stage is very different in America versus the world, which is something I feel like I've taken for granted. Like I am used to I'm used to politics being basically about personalities, but like both in China and Russia, the media were concentrating on the fact that the level of politics is very low. Like they compared it to like kindergarten. Like they said use the word kindergarten. They're like Trump and Biden were talking on a scale of kindergartners because they were using the only metaphor or reference they could use for competing with each other is not ideas or politics or even policy, but rather golf.
Right.
But what was
Rather
interesting,
what?
but rather by golf. Like, and what was interesting is, first of all, Putin said, I take it very seriously that a presidential candidate, and he was referring to Trump, that Trump, who's not even president, but a presidential candidate, is talking very sincerely about ending the war in Ukraine. And he was like, and I take that sincerely, and I take him up on that offer. And then apparently, the Chinese media concentrated on, the Chinese media did their own interviews of Americans who were watching the debate, and they specifically highlighted a quote from an American who shook his head at the debate and being really frustrated with it and said, I don't know, man, there must be something wrong with the system. And I feel like that emphasis on like, this is a crisis of a system, like you said, the fundamental. Even if like you take Joe Biden out, Kamala for some reason, it doesn't change the fundamental crisis, which is a collapse of a system and the separation between the ruling elite and the people. But that's also why I think it was helpful, Doc. Like the word interregnum, I think is really interregnum is really important, because the concept of that right now is in transitional phase that is not determined to go either. There's lots of paths. I feel like is really important, and it helps clarify why there's a need for new theory, better theory, new theory, and also why, like we've said a lot of times, for some reason to me it really clicks this thing of why the ideological struggle is so imperative in these times. Ideas, theory, not just for the future, but new theory to even analyze or assess both what we inherit, the system we inherit, the crisis of a system that we inherit, and then also, which is also in some ways us understanding what really is American history, not like ruling elite's version of history, but the people's history, and then also helps understand the crisis today. And yeah, that's why I really like the word interregnum and like the transitional phase. And I guess one other thing I wanted to add in was that, speaking of labor unions, like, I don't know if you guys saw, but I just saw that Sean O'Brien of the Teamsters is speaking at the RNC. And it's historically unprecedented for a major, because most labor unions are aligned with the Democratic Party. This will be the first time in a long time that the president of one of the largest labor unions, representing the largest sections of like what's considered to be the industrial working class, like a certain type of stable working class across the country, will be speaking at the RNC. And that's because of Sean O'Brien and Trump. Like, first of all, it's because Sean O'Brien and the Teamsters are basically, to a certain degree, have also internally accepted that they think Trump will win. Which a lot of unions, other unions will continue to deny, because they have to continue propagating a narrative to their own members. Like what Gen Z would call manifesting. Manifesting. Yeah. But I mean that's like my country too. But I think it's also because, yes, and that's a big deal, because also the Amazon labor union chose to affiliate with the Teamsters.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and that, like, they made a specific decision to affiliate with the Teamsters rather than they couldn't be independent anymore. They don't have the dues. They don't have the power, so they chose to affiliate with the Teamsters, like specifically. Something seen as anti-status quo, anti-democratic party, also anti-like ruling in a lot of ways. That the Democratic Party is very much at the center of a war policy, the status quo, the fundamental system that is in crisis, and then like I think the last thing I just wanted to say is the reason why the interregnum and then also theory, this thing of like how imperative it is, first how indispensable good theory is in a time of crisis, which we talked about last week too. That like even Marx and then also Lenin, so Marxism and Leninism, was specifically a theory for crisis. Like that theory, the most important theory, like comes out in a time of crisis, that it's today's a moment like that. And I think that's important because, for example, like even just taking like some of our other people who are also talking about similar things as us, and they would consider themselves more Marxists or Marxist Leninists, versus us seeing ourselves as very much rooted in Du Bois as the forerunner, Du Bois as the center, Du Bois as the framework, is that in an interregnum period like now, it becomes even important about how people understand, okay, we all know that there's a crisis or a collapse of system, but then there are questions like, what do you think the system is? Like, what do you think the system is defined as? Is the system capitalism, or is the system something else? Like, it's a question of, well, what really is the system or the crisis system? Which is why I think the framework of a social system is also important, or the way we were talking about different modes of historical movement. That it's not necessarily just one dimension or one mode of class, but rather the system is defined by other things. And then the other thing is, how do you also see, like, along with what defines the system is also what defines the crisis. Because I think people can acknowledge, like, we all have similar observations that there is a crisis, but the question is what defines it. And I think that's where theory comes in. Because that's where Baldwin, I think Baldwin defines the system differently. And that is also something that we have to, like, we're challenging ourselves to actually articulate and define. And part of it is that King and Baldwin would define the system as very, like, the modes of the system, or like how they define the criteria of the system comes from the stance of them being from the Black proletariat. And again, I just think the categories that your framework, your worldview, even your theoretical or philosophic categories are very different when you come from the Black social system or even as a Black person. And because, for example, in America, there's not just a working class. You have the Black working class and the white. Like, there's not one singular working class. And they actually don't share the same, they will not share the same quote unquote instincts. That might not be the right word, but you have to explain it. Whereas, for example, maybe in China in the 1940s, or China in the 1900s, you could be like, yes, there is such thing as a peasant class and a working class. Like, it's not like there's a Han working class and then there's something else. It's not like that. It's like, it's very, the historical constitution of the people, the American people, is different. And so all of this comes into question. And I think that's why this period, even being able to even see this as an interregnum that requires community theory is also what kind of makes understanding Baldwin and King and actually be able to understand how these are the revolutionary thinkers and also the revolutionary, like the Third American Revolution.
Well, I just wanted to add that I think part of what, I guess, to underline, like, what does a new and better theory answer? I think one aspect of it is what, like, has already been said in terms of explaining the world that people live in and explaining how it came to be this way and why it is that way. And I think the other part of it is also addressing this question, though, of, like, almost in the way, because recently in one of the reading groups, we read King's Pilgrimage to Nonviolence. And I think part of what King was searching for was a philosophy that not just explained human beings and human nature and human capacity, but also a philosophy that could facilitate the almost like a revolutionary break and a new movement of the people. And so basically part of what we're searching for is a philosophy, a theory, a new way of thinking, a new way of understanding the world that also enables the people to act in a decisive and new way in the midst of a systemic crisis of basically world historic proportions. And that's part of what I think King found through nonviolence was not just a theory that explains the world, but also a theory that enables the people to act and to move in a decisive way. And that's part of what I think we are also looking for, both with, how we've been studying the Third American Revolution, but specifically the thinking of people like King and Du Bois and Baldwin. And that I feel like part of what we're trying to raise out is, basically a new kind of way that people can operate politically and to move and to almost like find each other in a new way in the midst of this crisis. And I feel like a lot of that flows like also manifests in terms of like the work that we do in free school. But yeah, I just feel like it's also really important, like what Doc, you were saying about how, especially in the election, I think part of what still is kind of like looming in the minds, especially at least from what I've seen of young people, is still the fear of Trump and the fear of what a Trump presidency will mean. And like there will be like memes online about like Project 2025 and stuff like that. And I feel like that's a lot of that's kind of like arguable and debatable, like how much of that's an actual serious like agenda by Trump himself versus how much of it is coming from more of the conservative think tank class, parts of whom I think Trump has made an alliance with. But I think like the larger question though is, let's say in all likelihood, the American people, large enough parts of the American people decide we're going to make, whether we like Trump or not, we're going to make a strategic move and basically oust Biden or oust the Democratic Party from rule. And that basically means being okay with the Trump presidency. And this is also aside from the MAGA movement itself. But I think if we're viewing things instead of from the angle of like, oh, like, how is this going to, quote unquote, enable Trump or empower Trump? Really, the question is, how are the people going to move? And let's say if Trump comes into the presidency and like, whatever he tries to do, especially in terms of the domestic agenda, aside from, global kind of like imperial consequences, I think the larger question is, what will the American people do in that context? And will they also be satisfied with like Trump, not just as a disruptor, but Trump also as like some form of governance? Because I think that's been like the larger question kind of looming about Trump himself is the Trump thing, is it a phenomenon of a movement, but can it become something that actually has any kind of governing quality? And I don't know if it really does. And I think that's part of what even like the Orange Cast like opinion piece brings out. But the last thing I wanted to say was part of what I feel like we've been talking about for the past couple of weeks in free school about kind of the logic and the modes of historical movement is that it's not just that what Du Bois or Baldwin brings to the table like illuminates kind of like a new, or I guess the better way of putting it is that it's not just that the uniqueness of the American situation requires like a better way of analyzing that. So you could say like, oh, like because America's had, the slave system, it had the color line, that requires a better way of actually encapsulating like that kind of total societal question and the logic of the movement. It's that I think what we've been reaching towards is that the Third American Revolution itself, and also the Second American Revolution, that these yield new understandings of human beings, of human capacity, and also the logic of historical change. Because this is something that I was like trying to capture in like the essay from the last issue of Avant-Garde, but this question of why did the civil rights movement happen when it did is not a simplistic one, because kind of a very easy way of let's say like a Marxian way of understanding kind of like what produces revolutionary moments in history is kind of like kind of the materialist one, where it's like crises are produced by economic crises and that this is the greatest possibility for a revolutionary movement to occur. But the irony about the civil rights movement is that it didn't occur out of the kind of economic crisis in the US, at least by like most standard measurements. And if anything, part of what I was trying to work out was it seems like a lot of what produced the Black freedom movement, the Third American Revolution, was a world crisis of imperialism and a world crisis of basically Black people seeing the rest of humanity on the move, and also Black people having a consciousness of themselves in history, where King is like, I think this is in Why We Can't Wait, where he's trying to explain why the Third American Revolution occurred when it did. And part of what he says is that Black people became very conscious of it's been 100 years since emancipation and we're still not free. And I think this has to be taken into account basically, what propels history forward, especially in the American context, but then does the Third American Revolution yield new insights and knowledge about human beings, about the course of human history from that? But I don't know. Yeah, I just feel like it's very exciting, but also in some ways, part of the task we're undertaking is a very large one. Yeah.
Can I throw something in? Hi, I'm Grace. I haven't been here before. There is a really interesting book about social movements called The Quiet Before by Gal Beckerman. And one of the things that it looks at pretty extensively is that a lot of how our social movements form and move is based on the modes of communication in which they happen. And I think one of the things that's really hindering us from developing a new theory and a new way of understanding the world is that our current mode of broad communication is largely social media, and that's a mode of communication that strongly prioritizes stuff that is public and emotional and snappy and, funny and sharp. And that does not encourage us as a broader populace to think carefully or to disagree with one another or to really workshop ideas and see what we all bring to the table, because it's an environment that is so apt, it's not you and your buddies sitting around a table and figuring out how you think the world works. It's you and your buddies, at the panel table and, up in front of a stage. A lot of what we've seen in historically really impactful social movements that have had lasting impact is that they cook for a while, right? They spend a lot of time before they're out in front of the public, sitting and disagreeing with one another and workshopping and thinking and considering and really studying before they have to make a move. And one of the things that's so hard about the spot that we're currently in is we're just in a state of rolling, ongoing crisis where everything is in front of everybody all the time. I don't think that gives us a lot of time to think. And I wonder as well, or think and really talk. With what you were saying about the New York Times and the mass media, right? The mass media really exploits that as well, in that, we live in this overwhelming influx of information all the time. Part of the function of the New York Times or Fox News is to tell you what to think so that you don't have to really sit and work through it all yourself, because there's so much ground to cover. So I don't know. I think about that. I think about the lack of time and space to really think. And I also wonder how many people's brilliant insights are being buried right now by the fact that they are not popular public figures or people who look good or function well on Twitter, X. And I wonder how many people's insights are being crushed by the fact that they're working 80 hours a week to try and feed themselves. The spectrum of people who we're hearing from right now is very small, and the number of real dissident thinkers is much, much smaller.
Yeah, I guess that's why they call it an echo chamber. Because I think a lot of people's metric of success in left movements is how many followers you have. And what you said really resonates with me, because you don't struggle with ideas in social media. And I think that it's like what you were saying, Doc, about polling, or rather, there's an old saying, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. And, when we're the polls that the union leadership and the ruling class are using don't seem to reflect the conversations that we have every day, where there's a really strong sense of dissatisfaction and Raya and Gannon were talking to me. When Gannon's not here. Raya and Gannon have talked to me about, going to the Trump rally with an open mind and talking to people there, and just how dissatisfied they are. But that's across, so many categories of Americans. It's almost complete, and it's sort of bewildering why the political class would take those polls seriously, that everything's fine, the economy's never been this good, Joe Biden's done so much, why aren't you grateful? And then lastly, I wanted to say I voted third party the past two elections, and and to the people who would vote Democrat this upcoming election, you have a chance to be disruptive to the system, even if you don't agree with Donald Trump. But you have an opportunity to cause a political schism. And why would you? I think, Doc, I told you the last time I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I voted for Jill Stein, but I felt like something was left on the table there. And so many Americans were scared by the media. I think that, as Grace said, like emotion on social media or mainstream media drives so much of the content. And so many people were scared that, if Trump wins, it'll be the end of democracy. But we had 4 years of Trump, and nothing blew up. And
In the capital.
in the capital, and nothing blew up in America. And I think a lot more people will be less intimidated to vote to be disruptive. I think you've said that in the past, Doc, that this is Trump is the people's smear on the political class.
Yeah.
He's an outsider. He doesn't fit in. It's sort of a FU to the political class. I think that more people will take the opportunity to say FU, especially after Biden's performance, and even if it's Kamala or Pete Buttigieg, even if they're younger, it's like what Emily said. Like there won't be a disruption to the current political system, which so many people are longing for.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, well, because something Grace said that Grace and Samir was saying that reminded me was, like, in your intro, Doc, you said, you're like, just because we're at a moment where it's very clear, or just because you're the ruling class doesn't mean you can rule. Like, that can be that really kind of struck me.
And that's the paradox they're faced with, if you don't mind.
No, yeah, like, that was really, I think that's important too, where
their identity
Yeah.
does not kind of jive with their capacity.
Yeah,
Their
like, that's
identity
really
is that's what Biden said. I rule the world. Really?
But do you? Yeah. The paradox. Yeah, that's the paradox.
I'm sorry.
No, because also I think that's what's interesting is also, because I was reading this Washington Post article about, like, speaking of media that's really just, maybe that's really not giving much information, but it was an article where they interviewed, like, the Washington Post does this thing all the time where they're like, we're going to take one specific state and interview Black people and see what they say. And they're in Georgia, in rural Georgia, we're going to interview Black people and see what they think about the election. And it was like, they were like, in the place that produced Otis Redding and Little Richard, which actually does give context, right? Because we're trying to say, like, this is a place where it's like we're talking about real Black people, not like fake, like deep South Black people. And they were doing interviews, and it was funny because every person interviewed was like, I'm not don't get it twisted. I'm not interested in saying I'm a this person or that person. All I can tell you is I'm not happy with the economy. And they're like, and what I mean by economy is I don't just, like, I'm not it's like they're not being economic reductionists, wherever the academic term is, but for them, they're just like, I feel like I've been lied to. You know, they were like, I gave Joe Biden a chance. I don't think anything has been done. So that's why I'm pretty open to anything. You know, they're open to anything this time around. And they're like, it's that simple. Like, if I'm lied to, I do a little switcheroo. Like, and then the Washington Post then they took the mic away and they interviewed someone from the Biden administration. They're like, well, it seems like a lot of people are concerned about two things. No surprise. It's one, inflation and the economic hardship that people, like real Americans, are feeling on the ground, and then immigration, especially if you're in the South. Because I think you said this last time. People are trying to make it into a race thing when they're like, oh, Trump said black jobs. Like, what the fuck does he mean by black jobs? But then actually, this black voter in Georgia was like, you know, it's true. I'm scared of my black job being taken away. He's like, I don't think I've known for a long time no one has cared about my job. So he's like, yeah, like, what happens when this black job is black? Like, I don't know how my black job became a black job, but now my black job is it's not going to be a black job anymore. So what's next? Like a super black job, which is a non-existent job. Like, you know what I mean? But what was interesting is then when the Washington Post interviewed the Biden administration, they were like, what do you think about everyone saying like that they have to work 3 jobs? Like one guy was literally like, he was like, I have my normal job, and then I created like a mobile smoke shack where I make ribs, it's a second job, and he's like, and then my third job is I'm a mobile DJ. This is hard here, I'm running out of hustles. You know, like people picking up like these really like intense hustles, and then so anyways, so they were interviewing the Biden, and then the guy from the Biden administration was like, apparently he like spoke on anonymity. He was like the way the Washington Post described it was, he was like, this aide was so exasperated because he was like, all the numbers are saying the economy has never been better. So why is it that not a single ordinary person has been able to tell me that the economy is good? And it's funny because the aides, like here you have these aides who are part of this governmental infrastructure, like the people who are ruling, the ruling class, even if they're not Biden, they're the aides who are just like, I do not understand the numbers, but the experience is something else. Like, what the fuck am I supposed to do? And it's just, yeah, it's this, and like, okay, the data might not even be correct, but it's also, there are just so many layers of like, once you lie, you start with small lies that accumulate to bigger and bigger lies. It's a whole system. The whole American system is built at this point on many different lies and many different institutions that here you have a ruling elite who can't even rule. And these aides are just like, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with the fact that the numbers say everything's great, but people are turning away more and more away because they're saying the numbers are fake. And it's like, it is interesting.
Because I think Samir said this earlier, but part of watching the interview with Biden and George Stephanopoulos yesterday, so much of the undercurrent of Biden's anger, like I felt like he was really angry in the interview with parts.
But he's always angry. But that's a symptom of his situation.
Yeah, but part of it is
anger
but part of
and
it
paranoia. I'm sorry.
No, well, because it seems like part of it is this thing of like, why aren't you more grateful for everything I've done?
Yes.
Why aren't you more grateful that I kept NATO together? Like, why aren't you more grateful that like? He also said, he's like, yeah, like I've been doing wars all around the world. But that's part of the delusion of the ruling elite. But that's part of it's like, yeah, like they're genuinely confused that the people aren't more grateful to them for quote unquote everything they've done. And but yeah, that's part of like it's almost like it's a neurosis that they have. But it's not just a cognitive thing, but
I want to add to that. I mean, going back to the article that we were talking about, I mean, he's a conservative guy, so, a lot of the solutions he's offering to this problem of the ruling elite is also, again, too much about the economics, But the thing that he does get, I mean, the logic is solid, is how he portrays the ruling elite as a group of people who don't realize that they are elected into office, not don't realize, they don't accept that they are elected into office to carry out the democratic demands of the people, but instead, the neurosis that Jeremiah is also talking about is that democracy is no longer considered to be the will of the people, but democracy is the will of the ruling elite, and they actually place the American people with the responsibility of keeping their status, of keeping their, that is their job. Like they have the God-given right to be where they are on top of everybody. And if the people go and vote somebody like Trump into office, then they are the ones who failed democracy.
Yeah.
So democracy is,
The problem's not us, it's the people.
democracy is all about the ruling elite. As long as their way of life, their worldview wins, that's democratic. Otherwise, it's not. But then one more thing I wanted to say, Doc, something you said in your introduction, it was a very moving thing where you said great sentiments of a people live on and become a part of the culture and life world of a people. And I mean, I haven't heard it put that way, and it was very clarifying because this is like now in the light of what you said, if I think about, say, the Indian freedom struggle or the Third American Revolution, it makes sense that these movements are not just transient or like a temporary reaction to something going on that time, but actually changes the character or quality of a people. But even going back to something you were saying about the sentiment toward peace being at its height now than it ever has been before, I feel like we still run up in this moment against the problem that creates sentiments of the people, even if they exist, cannot coalesce into a movement that actually takes society forward. And I feel like that is going to be a challenge for a new peace movement in our time. And it's, I think, related to what everybody, even Grace was saying about the breakdown of dialogue and discourse and thought and theory, where even though there are these sentiments, you can see that the American people are more anti-war than they've ever been. And there is, especially with the student movement, something of a consensus developing on positive peace, even if it's not put that way. It's still not clear how that's going to channel into, an actual process of transformation because of all of this bullshit, where theory has been replaced by narratives.
There's
Can I just say one thing,
sorry.
Grace, if you don't
Go
mind?
for it.
I just want this is, I'm always drawn back to something, a story that Emily tells about one of her co-workers who says every day she wakes up, she thinks of Jesus and Martin Luther King. A new quality, a new human being. New human beings, the initiation of their birth was that period.
Right.
And I just, but go, I'm sorry, I said this interruption.
one thing that I remember looking at as an analysis of the work of Martin Luther King Jr. was the authors termed it common humanity politics. That we live, I think, in a time, especially when people are telling us very strongly that we need to vote according to our identity in whatever social order the person speaking happens to think is important, whether it's, you need to vote as, belonging to your own racial or ethnic group, or your class distinction, or your job, or your region, right, your geography. And I think it can sometimes put forward a narrative that it's, you and people just like you against everybody else. There's never ever a singular the people, right? There is such an incredible variety of human experience. And this was something that Martin Luther King Jr. pushed very strongly was, we are humans and we're being harmed. Right? We are humans suffering injustice. We are like you, right? Even through our differences, we have humanity that we share. I think there's a sense in kind of pushing for that. I know I've experienced that in my own life. I work in natural disasters for a living. And one job that I've had is going door to door, knocking on people's doors after a disaster and saying, "Hi, would you like to register for assist, or have you registered for assistance? Would you like to register for assistance?" And talking to people about the impacts after a storm, and I've kind of lost my train of thought on that, but I think definitely there's power and future to be had. And we've seen historical success in appealing to strategies of working together, including and despite differences. Not to be super cliche about it, but I think the current strategy that we've got going to say, we're the real people, they're not. And, we need to shape the world in our vision, just winds up collapsing when the group isn't big enough,
That's interesting.
I wanted to add something to what Rupa said and because she was referring to something you said, Doc, that the American people are now quite anti-war, and we were comparing that to a pro-peace sentiment, anti-war versus pro-peace. And I think that I have been thinking about this. I know you. I feel like the American people are definitely anti-war, but I also feel like this path that we're going on, looking for new theories, looking towards King and what he said about a radical revolution of values, I think that is what is going to tip it in favor of pro-peace. I have a feeling like the people are still more anti-war than pro-peace. And that is because their material conditions are disastrous. Like Emily said, on the ground, they're not being able to find jobs, they're not being able to provide for their families, and that breeds a certain amount of resentment. And the most clear example that they can see is all of their hard earned money, which they provide to the government, which should be helping them, is going to fund racist wars abroad. I know that economics is something that has been purposely obscured, but it has also been made a very great part of everybody's lives. And I feel like till we actually come to a point where somewhat the material lives of people can be improved, but at the same time also impressing upon them that you can't get there without the Baldwin Du Bois complementarity and understanding your history, understanding what love means. This is not a very full formed thought because there's so much happening at the same time, but the concrete conditions are very clear. Biden says that he's added 200,000 jobs. Why is unemployment going up then? You can add jobs to the existing economy, but then why is unemployment percentages rising? That's the paradox that actually interests me the most. This absolute neurosis that is that the Biden team is facing, where they see the numbers, but the material conditions don't reflect that, and they can't understand it because they have not spent a single day of their lives in the shoes of the very people they claim to represent. And I think that China is actually also learning from the United States. China is also learning from the United States to not let their community become like ours. Like I read an article yesterday in the South China Morning Post, which says that China is going to cap the salaries of their financial service executives. Um, and I think the reasoning that they provided is that, we look at the US and we see that all these brilliant minds are going into the financial sector, and then they're earning millions and millions of dollars because there's no real cap on how much you can make in the financial industry. And they're not really contributing to society itself. So they're incentivized to actually, contribute all of their effort to building up this sort of invisible, almost intangible stock market and all of their profits, but they're not actually contributing to the building up of society. So China was like, nope, not having that. We're just going to cap the salary so that the incentive is to a certain extent. And I feel like the same way that China is saying that we're not going to make these mistakes, I feel like the United States should also look at China and say that what are they doing? But it's like Purva was saying, they're doubling down on this notion that the reason why democracy is failing is because the people are failing the democracy. Because I think I only read a couple of pages of that article, but I think the sentiment was very clear that the people have put us in power, and if they put somebody else in power because they're discontented and something happens, we're not responsible. Yeah, I mean, Biden is clearly quite delusional at this point. I mean, during this George Stephanopoulos interview, I felt like it was more of an intervention. It was more of an intervention where George Stephanopoulos for like 25 minutes is like, "You're old. Can you admit that you want to leave? What if these people came up to you and said that they want you to leave? Would you do it then?" I mean, it was just kind of an intervention, telling grandpa to go to the old age home because he burnt the house down. But it was really revealing, because when they started talking about the polls, and George Stephanopoulos was like, "You are trailing Trump. You have been trailing Trump, and after this recent debate, you're further behind." And all he had to say was, "Well, the polls aren't accurate, and then I'm only trailing him in like the New York Times and the CNN and the NBC." I'm like, that's all of the major ones. Like, these are the ones who are supposed to. These are the ones who are supposed to support the Democratic Party. And he said that, "No, I don't believe them." This assertion.
Manifesto.
Yeah, I don't believe the polls. That only comes because it's interesting, because he's the one who, during the 2020 elections, he was like, "I'm leading Trump. We should trust the polls." Yeah.
Right.
So, and now he's like, "I don't trust the polls." So, it's completely.
Could I just, this is something in what you're saying, Sean, if no one else wants to speak, Shantanu and Jeremiah. Jeremiah asked the question, what drove the civil rights movement?
Right.
And why there was not profound economic distress, not unusual economic stress. And you're right, Black folk, though not at the same level, had experienced the post-World War II economic boom that all people, all workers had. But what was driving all of this, and why would a leader with the vision and message of Martin Luther King, who was pictured in photos with a picture of Gandhi behind him in his office? I mean, what does this mean? Either it was not a revolution, which I like to say, many people said that I like to explain some of the arguments, or this was a revolution of a different type.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
And what type was it?
Right. Right.
And I know Shantanu seems to be arguing that that economic conditions are the driving force of of most radical social change.
I don't know if I'm saying that.
Oh, okay. You said,
I said currently because of the material conditions that people are facing, they are. It's what Baldwin says that like you distract people from what's really important by focusing their attention to other things. Like earlier, they were distracted from their own material conditions by all of the wars that happened, and now I feel like they've slightly changed that to distracting from the moral imperative by saying that, hey, focus on the economy.
okay, this is very important. I would agree. See, I think there's a lot that still has to be understood about this movement. First of all, it did not fit classical, let's say, Marxist Leninist theory. In a certain way, you could apply a Leninist thesis, i.e., the national question, that along with the class struggle, there would be the national struggle of oppressed, colonized groups. And in the world communist movement, Black people were seen as a part of the world colonized majority. This was greatly appreciated by Black folk. That's what you see in the Metropolitan Museum exhibit. You see in the poetry of Claude McKay. You see all of these Black people joining the Communist Party and going to Moscow and what did they call it? The Institute of the Oppressed. We're the Deng Xiaoping and Judah and Zhou Enlai and Ho Chi Minh and Kim Il Sung and others. And Black people, for the first time, saw their oppression being put on a par with all of the anti-colonial movements. However, even that does not explain what emerged in Montgomery, Alabama, and then became what we call, and I think legitimately so, and what the participants like Lawson and Nash, all of them called a freedom movement and a revolutionary struggle. That was a hard and bitter pill for most Marxists, Leninists to swallow. Some took, for instance, you take the SWP, which is Trotskyite. They took a completely anti-Martin Luther King position. I mean, there was no two ways about it. Martin Luther King was an assimilationist, a reformist, and I don't know that they said it this way, but it was implied. It was distracting from the class struggle. This was said. This is why Henry Winston, when he writes Strategy for a Black Agenda, and I every time that I mention the book, I always have to say, completely misunderstood, completely unappreciated. I mean, it just, and it was a defense of the Black freedom movement. And he says the trajectory of Black freedom and thus of American history, this is very interesting, is Douglass, Du Bois, and King. These as nodal points. Well, I don't want to get myself confused, but what I'm saying is I agree with you, Jerry. First of all, that the Black freedom movement of the 50s and 60s begins the creation of a new people and a new nation. Not complete. Grace, I agree with you. The human is the central category. What had changed between, let us say, 1848 and the Communist Manifesto and 1958 or 1968? What had changed? And if nothing had changed, then this was a reformist, distractive movement of bourgeois preachers, you know? But if there had been a change in the ideological relations of humanity with one another, then this reflected not only that moment, but the future.
Right.
And so I don't have all my words together the way I want to say it. It's somewhere locked in my head somewhere. But to trivialize or ignore that as constituting a qualitative change, or maybe it was in it, or a movement towards a qualitative change. To trivialize that is to not understand the paths out of the current interregnum. And hence, in the name of something of the past, you have condemned yourself, because you're not condemning the American people, because pretty much they don't listen to you. You condemn yourself to a prison built with walls of dogmatism. And ultimately, like all solitary confinement, you go crazy. You can't do anything with that theorizing. And I listen. I do. Right. I listened to Midwest Marx, and I listened to the discussion they had about the 32nd Party Convention and the violation of the Constitution of the party. And then I listened in part to the next one where some people were saying how they were purged unconstitutionally from the party. And then the conclusion being that we must take over the Communist Party in the name of communism, upholding communism against the party connected to the Democratic Party. And honestly, and like I like the cats in Midwest Marx, I really do. And I feel a certain responsibility for them and to them. Because a lot of what they're talking about, they don't know. Like I heard one of the young guys saying, he was talking very, like he was back in the days, back, and everybody had a certain suit and tie on. And he said, I was in the Communist Party for 3 years.
Yeah.
I mean, not saying 3 years, you didn't even get your feet wet. And what you were in was not really a communist party. You know what I'm saying? It's not a party built upon people who'd been tested in battle. You know what I'm saying? So there's not enough experience to draw upon. Perhaps theory, perhaps books that you have read, etc. But no, it's not enough experience. And when I say I felt a certain responsibility as a cat that had gone through some of that, having experienced some of that, and 26 years is a lot longer than 3 years. And I was saying to myself, maybe I could tell them some of my own experiences. Maybe I can tell them a little more about Henry Winston. Maybe I could tell them, what the Soviet Union was like, so on and so forth, what it was like to participate in the world communist movement, because there is no way. And then the other missing link is the Black freedom movement. You just don't know the American people and the changes that they are going through unless you understand that, and the great Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King is so much embedded in the DNA of this society. More than, you talk Eugene Debs, good man, but does not transform the deep structure of people's being. I would say, don't chase windmills. You must have a program of struggle for the American people at this time of deep crisis and comprehensive and total crisis. And here I agree so much. When Emily talks about Baldwin, he is not attacking white people, he's attacking whiteness. And saying that the great obstacle towards the emancipation of the human being is whiteness itself, a fiction invented, like Du Bois says, as a result of the slave trade. There was no need to call yourself white unless you had an inferior that you called black. So it is that historical dialectic that we have to understand in this moment if we're going to move forward. No disrespect, believe me. I just think it's just like take Lenin back in his time. They were in a social democratic party that was Russian that split, and they formed their own thing, the Bolsheviks. Suppose once they achieved power, they said, well, let's now go back and take over the Social Democratic Party, be it in Russia or in Germany. This big party with all of these resources, with everything they got going on, parliamentarians and all. Our job is to recover social democracy and make it what it should be. Right. They didn't do that. They said, this is a new epoch. I think we're in an analogous time. You just can't go back. I was saying it to Angelo D'Angelo. He was saying, look, Tony, we have renamed the journal, The Communist, that goes back to the 1930s. We've resuscitated the World Peace Council, and we've done this, that, and that. I said, Angelo, and I was very polite, of course. I said, Angelo, sometimes in going back, we obscure the present and the future. Mm-hmm. How much back then? And the Communist Party had 100,000 members. It was a huge party. It played a big role in the labor movement, in the black movement, and so on and so forth. But you talk to a lot of dudes and women from that period, they said it was good, but it wasn't all that. Really, with all of that activism, without a theory which saw the new moment that emerges with the defeat of Nazism, the rise of a more powerful Soviet Union with more political prestige around the world, yada, 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 the world communist movement, well, a new moment. And then, Martin Luther King. If you were to ask me, now, maybe back in that time, being 18 and 19, and I wanted everything to be resolved immediately, I would not have said this. And it took me some time, so much so that I remember, every Martin Luther King Day, I would wake up. Sometimes I'd be asked to speak at places, and I would feel an unhappiness. And I didn't know why. I didn't feel quite right. Until finally, a couple years ago, it came to me that I had not properly grieved his assassination. You know what I'm saying? We're in a nation that has not been allowed to properly grieve his assassination. But more, if revolutionary theorists act like all of that was passé, and that now we can get back to the real question of the class struggle. You misunderstand everything. And that's my last point, talk too much. This is what the trade union movement has become a victim. First of all, with the right-wing AFL-CIO leadership, George Meany and them, and they were right-wingers, they were pro-imperialists, they were pro-war. Okay, the class struggle was the American worker getting his due from the imperialist ruling class. And if the civil rights movement wants to talk about another issue, we will deal with you as the enemies of the trade union movement. As George Meany did, he did not see the civil rights movement as an ally of the working class or trade union movement. The UAW and Walter Reuther and them, they did, but not in its fullest sense. But then this is when Winston has to rethink what we mean by the class struggle. Because everybody that says class struggle ain't talking about the same thing. And most people that talk about it ain't really talking about freeing the working class because they miss the African American proletariat, the dynamic, most conscious element of it. How we know? Look what they have produced. You think James Baldwin is just a gay black writer? Well, you don't know Baldwin. You think W.E.B. Du Bois is just, I don't know what you think he is, by the way. Whatever you think through the lens of the 19th century, early 20th century, I would say is wrong. I really would. And hence you have to come to grips, to terms with the American people. And I think this crisis will demonstrate this. I agree with you. I agree with both of y'all, but this crisis will make ever clearer to us who the American people are and what the American people are capable of in terms of freeing themselves. And I think that we are in the epoch where the human beings, as articulated by Martin Luther King, will be the dynamic force for peace and for ousting this ruling class. And they will do it in the name of humanity. And once they do that, then they're connected to the world. And that's the key. Wait a minute. Okay.
Can I say
Yeah,
something?
go ahead.
Well, I agree with what we were saying about how I think the civil rights movement needs to be better understood as revealing an essence or an essential character of both the American people and also the American revolutionary process. Because Prabha had also brought this up, but that's one of the formulations that struck me the most from the remarks was this idea that certain moments or certain expressions of the civilization at a given time become like the shape of things to come, like the shape of the civilization to come. And I think that like beginning with that period of the Harlem Renaissance through like, the Third American Revolution, that period especially, I think said something that we can never go back from about who the American people really are. And I think one of those things is that so clearly America is not Europe. And these European standards, these European theories, I mean, the musicians definitely say it. They expire there was an epistemic break, like with the Harlem Renaissance, which I feel like is also what your presentation was about. And we're so far beyond that now that I think anyone who's hung up on the European framework is at least a century behind. Like at least a century behind serious.
It's a century.
But I was also thinking about something that you had said recently about how like we were talking about the relationship between King and Baldwin and a question of is it complementarity, is it synthesis, or blah blah blah. Did Baldwin go farther than King? But I really liked how you put it, which is that Baldwin can be seen or understood as a theoretical extension of King, who is capable of developing like some of the ideas that were first established with King and then crystallized in the movement into like at least the 1980s, which is significant because we were entering like a counter-revolutionary period at this point. So there's something about how a revolutionary kernel is sustained. But I brought that up because when you made that formulation where you said these great periods of time can become the defining characteristic of a people or a civilization after. I thought about Baldwin and how how he makes that formulation of to reveal the beloved to himself, and with that revelation to make freedom real. And I think it's significant because I feel like what you're saying is that there's a certain evidence. There's a certain evidence in, let's say, the Third American Revolution, or in R&B music, certain evidence that rock and roll will never have, that actually mirrors who the American people really are. And there's something about wielding that, which is maybe the way that, like, you can call it the truth, or establishing like the human frontier that is so essential to the American revolutionary process. And if these are the categories that we're even beginning to probe in, then it's just so obvious that the European framework does not work. It's completely irrelevant. You've completely missed the mark if that's your departure point. But I think this also has to do with the question of like the modern revolutionary process, or like, so.
Can I?
Yes, please. No. What's the word?
No.
Yeah. Definitely. I prefer you to go first. I'm only playing with you, Robert. Let's go ahead.
Maybe your question is related.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, basically, I guess I understood where I was listed.
Oh, really? Okay.
Lurking.
Distracted. This is my old man.
You mentioned in terms of the crisis that you said something about 3 options, like it will be either maybe civil war, long protracted. What was the third?
I said a pre-revolutionary, a pre-civil war, a combination of both, what Marx said, the ruin of all classes, which is the destruction of society,
So my question is, what do you feel, based on what you see, what you know now, what would you, if you were, to make a determination, what do you think will happen?
Well, I'm influenced by Jeremiah's thinking and the free schools thinking. I believe that if you were to put numbers, percentages, what percentage would you think would be moved towards gradually revolutionizing the science? I think,
You said right.
this is a good question, but let's say the revolutionizing of society, be it gradual or sudden. I think the American people, because of their experience, because of Martin Luther King, and I agree with you completely, Michelle, you can't go back to the 19th century. It's a whole different kind of people, a whole different stage of their consciousness, of their ideological development. I think the American people, I'm not saying all, a majority, but a committed, of let us say 25, 30 million are capable of revolutionizing the society or putting the society in a situation where the only option is a revolutionary change, by which I mean the toppling of the current ruling elite and its policies of war and austerity and racism. I think that is a high probability.
But over the generation.
No. I think in the current moment.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I think the counter revolutionary option is more the option of the ruling elite, who would rather see the society thrown into ungovernability and chaos as a strategy to holding on. I think a clash of these competing political forces, where perhaps the majority of people would remain on the sideline, is a strong possibility. The other thing is that, however it goes, the American people will come out of this stronger, and the ruling class broken, fragmented, even more than we now see them. But we are entering into such a moment. That's what I see, Rob. And the other thing, just the two other things, we have this. We've been talking about this idea of social systems, the black social system, and then the white supremacist social system. The black social system is a powerful resource of the overall people. The white supremacist social system exists only because most of the white majority have adapted to it and accepted uncritically and without contestation. But it is fragile. And in this respect, I hear what you're saying, Shantanu. Economic crises and motivations fit white people in their majority more than they fit black people. Black people are not driven in the same way, are not motivated in the same ways. So, I mean, all of these are questions that we have to look at going forward. And, I was just making the other argument. I was talking to my dear colleague Raya, and, that conversation that they're having about taking over the Communist Party and reestablishing communism. And this is why what Michelle is saying, I completely am sympathetic to. To go back to that is it, first of all, it's an impossibility. to reclaim communism. And communism, like Frederick Engels says, communism is not a doctrine, it's a movement, you know? So, people get it wrong. W.E.B. Du Bois joined the Communist Party. Did he change his? No, he didn't change his theory. He joined a movement, I can tell you, in the Communist Party, you did not have to be a Marxist-Leninist at all. And then some people may have started out that way, but then they changed. They became liberals. But they still adhered to the cause of communism in the sense of peace and anti-colonialism and those types of things. So we're looking at a movement, going back to a movement of a different period, doesn't make a lot of sense when you're looking at this people shaped by a movement led by the names that we know, King and Lawson and Nash and Abernathy and Coretta King, and who are not, quote, working class heroes, which is part of the tragedy of the working class, and I put quotes, movement. But the working class movement becomes more than itself and becomes what it must become when it becomes a part of this great human surge. And why do we say in the name of humanity? Like King said, love, we ain't talking about Baldwin and King, love. What does King say? Love is the sword that heals. Heals who and what? We have to take this seriously. And it must become not just words, but deeply grounded or grounding us as we live and go forward. That's what I would say, Robert. I'm sorry.
I would just say, and I'm
No, Alice.
to go ahead, but I'm going to put some notes together and send them over to you because I've harbored a real deep rooted pessimism for the past 15 years.
Yes.
That I have to sit there.
No, I feel it, and it's not unusual. Yeah.
Share it with you. We talk. My pessimism.
And Robert, share it with everybody because it'd be very useful for us to hear.
Well, I want to sit there based on the notes that you said, and then maybe we can address it.
Right.
But I think understanding too what we're up against in the enemy. That's part of why people so pessimistic because the enemy, to a large degree, is from within, meaning this broader community that
I understand.
and people who I love and deal with it. We're possibly thinking of where's your humanity? Where's your religion?
And I think maybe what I'm about to say is also related to what you might be feeling in terms of a pessimism that exists among people. And I know Doc has talked a lot about particularly African Americans in this country having given so much to the country and feeling like what more is there? Like how much can we continue? I've been trying to, I recently returned from China, and I know Doc has asked me to give me a report next week, so I'm trying to figure out what to say right now and relevant, and what is relevant next week, or that I should process more. But what I'll say is that so much of me is Afro-American, and what I've learned from the free school, and from King and Du Bois and Baldwin. And when I went to China and met my family members and also just ordinary people, there was so much to give in terms of, because you have a sense that China is moving forward, it's developing, and what is it that America, like what does America have to offer? And I will say that gives me a certain optimism where China also needs America, and specifically Afro America. And it's also because ordinary Chinese people don't have a way to understand an ordinary American, except for a very narrow view of America's on top, it's white, it's all these other things. And that there is such an opportunity there. But I say Chinese people, but I really mean the world, in the sense that what everyone has been saying and what Michelle was describing as a modern revolutionary process, because we're talking not just about the crisis that is happening, or a crisis that is only in of itself for America, but also how King and the Black freedom struggle connected what was happening in America to what was happening in the world anti-colonial movements. And you see this development now where it is a new moment in history where you both have the crisis that is here, but you also have this world democratic struggle to define the world, not just in terms of a hegemonic power, but actually what a world democracy looks like, where you have BRICS, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, but you also have all these other countries that are able to redefine or define the future of what is humanity and the world going to look like moving forward, especially as the ruling elite of this country is in collapse, that has had such a large grip on the rest of the world. And in this moment, I think it also connects to what we've been saying about the limitations of Marxism-Leninism, because let's say there's this world democratic struggle that's happening. What's missing is not communism, because I guess in some ways people can say it's already in China, they already have figured out some sort of economic model, but there's still economic model where they're still trying to figure out not everything has been figured out. And so is America's contribution going to be Marxism-Leninism, or is it actually something new? And that's also a reflection of what you perceive as the potential of the American people. Is it truly going to be something that's creative, that complements this world historic process? And, when I was in China, just parts of what I was in China, I was realized so much of India is in China. And the reason why I say that is because whatever America has to contribute will be something in terms of the scale of, Buddhism or Buddhism in India, nonviolence in India. It wasn't just an Indian, not just for India, but actually for the world. And what will come out of America will also be something for the world. And when I say that, the only thing that I can feel confident about is someone like Martin Luther King Jr. and the people and the values and the ideas that he represented. There's nothing else in American society that is truly new or new and actually contributes to a world human being. Because I think with China, and I say China because that's where I went, and also because it's the spearhead of trying to figure out what the future is going to look like. And there are different models, which is what are the mistakes of the ruling elite of the West? And this is what Shantan was saying about capping the financial salaries. But that's the missing piece is what are the people, what are the great sentiments of the people? Because the world doesn't know. As I was talking to my relatives, they're what is America? Because you also asked me this question, which is what are the questions that they asked me? Yeah. They're do they have guns in every household? Do the trucks look like this? There's those are questions of how are ordinary people living? What is it aside from the image and the narrative that has been put out there to the rest of the world by the ruling elite? But then there's also this other component, which is they were like, oh, I heard about the protests that were happening on these campuses. And, you know, what's happening is, or what is happening in Gaza is really terrible. I saw these protests. Like, what are the protests like? How are the people feeling about it? And that's a huge question, which I think we're trying to figure out, which is the American people have been so suppressed with the assassinations that happened. This like media as part of the state. But now in this moment, you do see like the people shouting out in anger, but also anger at a war and white supremacist culture that has suppressed the potential of the people, that is to actually give and create to the rest of the world. And I guess I say this also, yeah, like I actually really hope that it helps to alleviate some of the pessimism, because I promise you the rest of the world and like needs King.
I have no doubt about it. I just feel that I see so much in terms of middle America, you know, whatever, that has dismissed it. They have, you know, I belong to a black church.
They know Mother Beth.
Yeah. Before that, they don't read King. They don't talk about King in terms of, I belong to a fraternity. One of the main pillars of that organization, which is international, is who wrote The Miseducated?
Carter G. Woodson.
You think we are mandated to read that? Common sense would suggest a little bit, just a little bit of vision, like say, hey, we should read that. We should talk, you know, and that's what's so these so-called leaders, and I don't even want to say leaders so much because to be in Congress, somebody, you know, literally people, you know, and just like China needs to hear from us, that kind of thing. And what, just think about the cultural exchange potential. But instead, what we have is slime, like whatever Greg, what's that fool up in New York?
Gregory Meeks.
Yeah, that's all going over to Taiwan and encouraging the, you know, that's what we have, you know what I mean? And not only do we have who is, you know, in front of his office, throwing eggs, you know what I mean? And that's what's so pessimistic to me, that we don't have that. You know, we have this, we really don't, you know.
No, but small yet powerful.
Yeah, okay.
You'd be surprised.
I would also,
But we could go ahead. That's fair.
yeah, because it gets to this question of like pessimism and also probabilities, which I think is partially what you were raising, the probabilities of like X, Y, Z happening. And I feel like there can be maybe a tendency to just be like, okay, like this seems to be, given all the factors considered, like this seems to be the most probable outcome. Let's say like American society over the next like 5 to 20 years or something. And I think that it is important to consider different possibilities and outcomes, like Dog was saying, but also I think like whatever you call it, but like this question of like the human factor and how human beings act can never be totally just kind of tabulated in terms of like raw numbers and statistics and all that. And I think part of that is like, yeah, like even if you consider like the civil rights movement, I don't think anyone at the outset of that movement could have predicted where it went and what it achieved. And that's part of whether you call it faith, just human action. People have to make they make choices, they act in ways without knowing exactly what the outcome is going to be. And you could also say for today, who could have predicted that this tiny plot of land called Gaza could have ignited a world crisis and also completely changed the landscape of American politics over the span of basically like half a year. Like no one could have predicted this, even though people knew that, Palestine is happening.
Yeah.
Like this has been a problem for decades, but there's always this question of, like at a certain point, you have to take into like what Du Bois calls like law and chance of like, yes, like you have to understand like structural questions, historical logics, like institutions, how everything is arrayed. But there's always this unexplained element of like how human beings act. And I think that's also partially why, like, for instance, like Baldwin, like I forget which essay it is, but he's like, you don't, at the end of the day, like you don't need numbers. What you really need is passion.
Yeah.
And he's like, this is proven by the history of the world. And so I think, like that's part of, I feel like what also drives us is like, we don't know exactly what our impact is going to be, like in the city of Philadelphia or the country. But part of what drives us is like, no, like there's still some inner moral imperative that we feel that we have to act upon. And I think it's like, like you never know exactly what the impact is going to be. But I don't think anyone also could have predicted that the crisis in America would get this bad. Maybe even like 6 years ago or something, or like 8 years ago. And I think a lot of that is driven by also, like Doc was saying, a lot of that is driven by what the people do. And whether or not it crystallizes into like a coherent, very conscious like movement, I think is one thing. But I think part of what we've been describing is that if there is an actual crisis of legitimacy for the ruling elite of this country, that is a crisis which is born out of basically the sentiments of people and the people's dissatisfaction with the current governing system, the current ruling class. And like you can take that as you will and be like, oh, like there's a possibility that it could just. I feel like I've also seen kind of like superficial historical analogs of being like, oh, America mirrors like imperial Rome, for instance, and what we face is potentially like 100 years of just slow decline and everything is going to be bad from here on out. But one, like I don't think that like you can really kind of do like a one-to-one comparison between imperial Rome of like antiquity versus a very modern like social system and world situation. But yeah, I just feel like I think at a certain point, like you should like I think we have to think about like probabilities and possibilities and like what's possible in terms of outcomes. But I just feel like this human question has to also be taken into account as part of what drives the future and how people act. It's like I think we also in free school, it's like we're oftentimes surprised about the impact that we have, and we like even for instance, like let's say like for like speaking for myself as like because I'm also like Korean and so I'm interested in like the Korea peace thing and all that, and I feel like part of what's been really interesting is that even in a city like Philly, it's like this is not to toot our own horn, but in a lot of ways free school and the work that we've been putting in terms of trying to even formulate this question of like what is Korean civilization, what is the importance of peace in Korea, and how does that relate to the American people, like all of that, what free school's been doing. It's like free school has almost become this kind of like you can't avoid it in the kind of like nexus of like even like Philadelphia politics or specifically like Korean peace activists or whatever. And I guess I just bring that up in the sense that I think part of what we're trying to also put forward is that in this particular time of, whether it's a time of transition or an interregnum, all of that, like part of what we're putting forward is not just about ourselves, but that someone like Baldwin is almost inescapable. Like he's an inescapable figure for the American people. And it's like they almost like it's like you have to meet him on the road of I don't know. I was just thinking about like the road to Emmaus or like the road to Damascus kind of thing. To use a biblical metaphor, but I don't know. I just feel like that's part of what we're putting forward. It's like, you know, like Baldwin also speaks to exactly that question. Like, yeah, like no one knows exactly what the future is going to be. And I think the greatest danger actually is that Americans are so fed up with the system, but are all pessimistic and would basically kind of be like, I don't give a shit about anything. I'm just going to hunker down and try to protect myself and my family. And I think that is a possibility, and it manifests in a lot of different ways. And I think a lot of people feel that. But I think part of what I feel like we feel as our task is like, no, like actually, like there is a possibility of people coming together, finding each other in a new way, and speaking to one another in a new way that actually translates into like meeting the demands also, like the task which is presented to us by world humanity, where we have a unique responsibility as citizens of this country to be responsible for the future of the country. And I think that's part of why I think like Baldwin, I was just thinking about this too, like Baldwin has a very interesting formulation when he says very few people really want to be free. And I've always wondered about that because it's a pretty loaded and complex statement. But I think part of it like is that like if you view like this whole phrase of like freedom as a recognition of necessity, I think it's very difficult to actually take responsibility for your society and for the future. And I think that's part of what Baldwin means by freedom is like the recognition of responsibility, and that actually all of us have that responsibility. But very few people want to face that. But at the end of the day, like that is the criterion of what it means to be free, especially in this time. But yeah.
Could I just, in a small way, address? I can understand where you're coming from, Robert, in terms of pessimism, because it is you said 15 years now, and it is the playing out of a strategy in the Black movement that I think was, in a lot of ways, the wrong strategy. There was, after the assassination of Martin Luther King and the crisis that threw the movement into, there was this theory and politics put forward that we move from protest to politics. We move from sit-ins and demonstrations and civil disobedience to now with the vote electing mayors and congresspeople and senators and now presidents. And if you look at the church under the impact of King and the civil rights movement, the Black church became a church where morality trumped individual interests. There was a different theology in not every church. I know I grew up as a Baptist. My church was completely committed to civil rights. If you go there today, Alice and I have gone there and we've had events there, you still see the resonances of that. You know, where it's different than if you're at the Unitarian Church, where it's transactional, money, celebrity even, or what's the most popular liberal cause, you know? But this idea of from protest to politics, where protest was a signifier for the moral imperative, you do what is right, no matter whether it hurts you or not, whether you have to sacrifice or not, to politics where you're transactional and self-interested. And the preachers became like politicians. That's why you get Warnock down in Georgia, down at Martin Luther King's church. It's a disgrace. A politician, Mark, at your church, Tyler, he's become a politician in the pulpit. He makes his decisions about right and wrong are related to political things, who he's going to endorse, and I'll say that tomorrow. Hence, his knowledge of theology of King is very limited. I say that because I know Mark. And I'm not hating. I'm appreciating that he needs to be re-educated. You know what I'm saying? That is what and so as the church became a political instrument rather than a moral instrument, the people left. And then especially young people never go into them. So I think, and so your pessimism is the failure of the Black political class to bring about any change whatsoever, except if it changed their conditions of life and the cars and SUVs and private schools that their children went to. Same thing with the hip hop movement. You get young people who grew up in hip hop, they're very pessimistic because they thought that Snoop and Joe, was it Jay-Z, they call him Jehovah. That's how bad it got. And all that hip hop would liberate us. And even you said, no, it's not. Look what they saying. Oh, no, you ain't heard the real hip hop. You know? So then they said, Kendrick Lamar, he's the real hip hop. You know what I'm saying? I listened to him. I said, oh, man. And then they said, well, no, you got to go back to Public Enemy and KIS-One and Rakim. I said, okay, I went back. You know what I'm saying? But a failed vision, a failed strategy. And so here we are. And we look at the failures, but that doesn't mean that we can't learn from them. And that's what I'm saying. The church has to learn from the failure of becoming a political instrument rather than a moral instrument and an instrument of freedom. That's what the pessimism comes from. But unless you're prepared to die spiritually, you have to see a future.
Well, you know, I have faith.
And
I have faith in the Almighty.
see, that's what I'm talking about.
As the future might say,
Yeah.
God works in mysterious ways.
Okay.
You know, and I just think the real impetus for change and revolution is in fact God, Yemen, China, and
Okay.
I'm gonna put my money in it.
In the Jewish tradition, we have a phrase called tikkun olam, repairing the world. The idea that the world is broken, it's been broken since before each of us got here, and that the work of life is working on repairing it. You know, there's a famous quote to that effect saying something to the, I might not be getting this exactly right, but you are not obligated to complete the work, but you're also not free to abandon it. Which sticks in my mind. And I try and think about that when I see all sorts of different struggles and causes that people are fighting for. Like, it's really hard to get our heads around the fact that we ourselves as individuals might not ever see a world where we feel like things are better, right? And we might be heading for any number of things crumbling around us. But I think it gives some comfort, at least to me and my own faith and traditions, to think about us as one group of people in a very, very long string of humanity. There's been people before us, there's been people after us. Well, there will be people after us, and we're all working on it. So I imagine that even if we don't get there within our lifetimes, or even if it is a Roman Empire situation and we're headed for, you know, 100 years of slow decline, eventually things will change and materialize, and people are going to have to do the work, ourselves included. It's never going to be all the way done, but I don't think it's useful to walk away, you know?
Well, then we can do comments and then talk about the August.
Talk about the what?
August Baldwin.
Okay. There are some comments. Someone named Dalbert Sefton says, "Greetings from North Devon, UK. Long live the resistance." Todd, Future Homestead, say good morning. Someone named Jay just says, "The Democratic Party and the media are both enablers to this war show." How many members of the media who have propped up Biden through gaslighting and lying would you say for you? People like Rachel Maddow, Joe Scarborough, Colbert, Young Turks, and The View have lied on a daily basis through their propaganda. Future Homestead asks if we're planning to read Carlos Garrido's new book, where he leans heavily on Du Bois.
Yeah, it's a chapter on
And then Todd says that he's looking forward to reading it. Jacob Carpenter and M. Sparks also said good morning. And then someone named Michael Dubuque says good evening from the Philippines.
Well, our conversation also reminded me of Notes on the House of Bondage by Baldwin. Yeah, I feel like, yeah, because Baldwin always has this thing where he's like, I am forced to be an optimist because life is not academic. I refuse to believe human life is an academic matter. And yeah, I really like this essay, Notes on the House of Bondage, which he basically says that it's in response to the Carter-Reagan election, where he says, however Black people vote in the election will not say anything that deep. What will be the deeper reflection? What will be the deeper reflection is basically the movement of the people. And he talks about the House of Bondage, where he says, I'm speaking. He says, thus, what the House of Bondage accomplished for what we will call the classic white American was the destruction of his moral sense, except in relation to white. But it also destroyed his sense of reality, and therefore his sense of white people had to be as compulsively one-dimensional as his vision of blacks. The result is that white Americans have been one another's jailers for generations, and the attempt at individual maturity is the loneliest and rarest of the American endeavors. And he says, well, the planet is destroying the American fantasies, which does not give the Americans the right to destroy the planet. And he says, I'm speaking of the breakup, the end of the so overextended Western Empire. I am thinking of the Black and non-white peoples who are shattering, redefining, and recreating history, making all things new, simply by declaring their presence, by delivering their testimony. The empire never intended that this testimony should be heard, but if I hold my peace, the very stones will cry out. One can speak then of the fall of an empire at that moment when, though all of the paraphernalia of power remain intact, invisible, and seen to function, neither the citizen subject within the gates nor the indescribable hordes outside it believe in the morality or the reality of the kingdom anymore. When no one any longer, anywhere, aspires to be the empire's standard. And then he ends by saying, he says, like, I think this speaks to some of what we're saying. Someone my age, for example, may be pleased and proud that Carter has blacks in his cabinet. A younger person may wonder just what their function is in such a cabinet. They will be keenly aware, too, that blacks called upon to represent the Republic are, very often, thereby prohibited from representing blacks. A man my age, schooled in adversity and skilled in compromise, may choose not to force the issue of defense spending versus the bleak and criminal misery of the Black and white populations here. But a younger man may say, out loud, that he will not fight for a country that has never fought for him. And further, that the myth and menace of global war are nothing more and nothing less than the coward's means of distracting attention from the real crimes and concerns of this republic. and I may have to visit him in prison or suffer with him there, no matter. The irreducible miracle is that we have sustained each other a very long time and come a long, long way together. We have come to the end of a language, and we are now about the business of forging a new one. For we have survived, children, the very last white country the world will ever see. And I feel like that describes the moment now. This thing of no one, like I even think white people, like large sections of white people, what Doc, you were saying at the beginning, what Baldwin calls for, and actually what I think we get to witness now, is an undoing of an identity called whiteness that is not beneficial to people. That an undoing of an identity that turns out was never permanent from the beginning. It was never constant or eternal or permanent from the beginning, but actually an invention, a lie, and an undoing of an identity that large sections of the American people relied on and no longer can. And in this thing of like, Lord Baldwin says, no one, white and black in this country, no one wants to aspire to the empire standards anymore. And thus, the real question is the task of like, it's been a long, like, I think he says that in his interview with Nikki Giovanni, like his conversation, he's like, it's been a rough ride, and black people know that most of all. It's been a rough ride. But like the irreducible miracle is that we survived and sustained ourselves for a long time. And now are we going to forge a new language because the standards, the definitions that we've been convinced to uphold for a long time, like they're already going downhill. And yeah, just this thing of like, we've survived, children, the very last white country the world will ever see.
Yes.
And yeah, and it's also the way Baldwin says, he's like, Baldwin always says, he's like, I'm not really concerned about myself, like in everything I do. What I'm concerned about is the child. Like, what about the children? Like, he's always saying that. He's like, I'm not really concerned about me at this point. Like, what I'm eternally concerned about is, well, what about the children? And that's my responsibility. And I feel like that's kind of like the task that even we have, which is like, yeah, some of us are 20s, 30s, but like at the end of the day, it's like, it's not really out of concern even for myself. Right? Like I just turned 28 yesterday, and it's like, for me, it's like, well, what about the children? But some of these conversations are what we've been thinking about for the August event. So we wanted to announce that the next year Baldwin event, which makes sense, is that it's finally here, which is James Baldwin's 100th birth anniversary, and which is August 2nd. And so we're going to do a 3-day event. Friday, August 2nd, Saturday, August 3rd, and then it looks like we'll do a 3rd day on Monday, August 6th. So it'll be essentially a weekend of celebrating the great James Baldwin. And our purpose is to challenge ourselves to really make the case and pronounce it that James Baldwin is not just a revolutionary, but a revolutionary thinker, a revolutionary theorist, and a revolutionary philosopher for the American revolutionary process, that he's made an indisputable and irreplaceable contribution to the American revolutionary process. And in doing so, it's also us beginning to also say once again that Martin Luther King Jr., who Baldwin was a witness to, a witness for, and highly influenced by. In some ways, James Baldwin was a great student of Martin Luther King Jr. in the movement, even though he always called Martin Luther King Jr. like a little brother. That Baldwin, we want to talk, like in some ways, what we're doing is also defense of the great Black freedom struggle, which was about civil rights, but more importantly, was meant to unite the American people to enter what Henry Winston called that higher stage of struggle, which is for peace, for revolutionary, emancipatory democracy, and yeah, it'll just be really great to celebrate James Baldwin. But on that Friday, August 2nd, it'll be at the Church of the Crucifixion right here, and we're making a new documentary, which will be like a highly challenging artistic endeavor. Where unlike past documentaries, we're writing a script, so it's like us taking Baldwin seriously when he says, like we've talked about, which is like the artist is a revolutionary, but also to be a revolutionary in this time is to live and act like an artist, excavating and translating the revolutionary inheritance that we all have as Americans, the inheritance of King, like the long line of freedom fighters, Robeson, Du Bois. We already have it. It's just whether you see them as your own, take them into the future, their ideas. And so we're really challenging ourselves to translate these ideas for this time, and also like be part of forging that new language. And so we're writing a script for this documentary. We'll have this documentary on August 2nd for James Baldwin's birthday, followed by a panel. That's what we're thinking right now. Saturday, August 3rd, we'll also be at the Church of Crucifixion. It'll be around 2 p.m. through maybe 8 p.m. And this is going to be the climax of his birthday. And it'll be an Afro-Asiatic peace concert. That's what we're entitling it for now. And other people maybe can talk about the performers, or maybe if you want to talk about the performer stuff. But something we're really looking forward to is we found this Palestinian man from Washington, D.C. area. And it turns out that his name is Fouad Foti.
Yes.
And
Fouad
Foti. And we had found him because we were like doing what modern research is, which is Googling. And we discovered him, and he plays the traditional Palestinian instrument, the oud, I think it's called. And it seemed like he and his family had this band where they all play different instruments and they sing. And it turns out he's friends with Wilmer Leon, who's a great friend of the Free School and Doc's friend. And it turns out like they've known each other for a long time, but he's agreed to come, but we're just deciding on the dates. So we're looking forward to he and his daughter, who is this great opera singer.
Yeah.
She's a professional opera singer, and she also does dabka dance. She's a women's dabka group. And so hopefully she can come too. And she has in particular an opera. She adapted a Puccini aria called, and she calls it an opera for Palestine. Or I think it's opera for Palestine, or opera for the children of Palestine.
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
And she adapted it so that it's a mix of Arabic and Italian. So they'll be hopefully come for the concert. And we're crafting this peace concert because there's something about this time where it's a time for theory, and it's also a time, like I think when Baldwin says it's time to forge in the language, it's both a time for theory and a time for art, poetry. It's time for the poet. And Baldwin always says he's like more important than the statesman, the union leader, the whatever, is the poet. It's the poet who speaks to civilization in the future. And so we're still finalizing the program, but Serafino will probably sing, and Bobby Zankel and his group, and then also Alfie Pollitt will perform. And we're just piecing it together because we think the Afro-Asiatic Peace Concert in particular will be very important for celebrating and showing Baldwin as the revolutionary thinker, theorist, philosopher of our times, and really elucidating these ideas. And then it looks like Monday, August 6th, from 5 to 7:30, something like that. We'll be in the Parkway Central Branch of the Free Library's lobby. And Monday the 5th. Whatever's Monday. And Kathy, Blaze, Nuri, Manaski, and others are Serafina, myself, others. And honestly, everything we do, I feel like it's just everyone is cool. But we're putting together an exhibit in honor of James Baldwin, an art exhibit. And that will be at the Free Library. And so Monday will be an unveiling of that art exhibit to celebrate James Baldwin. And so on the Monday event, we'll unveil the exhibit, we'll do a guided exhibit tour, and we'll also have performances in the lobby of the Free Library. And so I'll let other people speak more, but this is I think we see it as our humble and also significant contribution to celebrating James Baldwin the way he ought to be.
I don't have very much to add about the programming, but I do want to talk about the peace concert a little bit. Well, I mean, going back to something that we were discussing a little before, this is a little unrelated, but I tried to get there. Is, you know, when we were talking about the communist movement back in the day, one thing, and Doc, please correct me if I'm getting carried away, but you know, I feel like that world communist movement cannot be separated from the world peace movement.
No.
And, you know, the struggle for national liberation and democracy in Asia and Africa.
Yeah.
And I feel like in the present day, I mean, I agree with everything that was said about how even communism, even as a revolutionary theory, might not be adequate for this moment. But then the conversation we were having was also making me convinced that the way people want to go back to those theoretical formulations also does not make any sense because it doesn't have anything to do with peace. You know, peace has stopped being a concern of this whatever reincarnated communist movement.
Well, I think it is, but anyway, but go
Oh,
ahead.
okay, that's what I meant. You know,
Yeah.
but what I was thinking was mainly about the civil rights movement and, you know, how the struggle for peace sort of came up as a natural part of the struggle for racial equality. But then that kind of a formulation of, you know, what the struggle for peace would look like, I mean, actually, it was new and a revolutionary contribution because it brought it firmly to the question of the individual moral transformation of the human being, where even to achieve peace, I think the question was, you know, what kind of human being do you need to be? You need to be a new kind of human being who accepts, you know, the nonviolent method, not just as a strategy for struggle, but also a way of life, a philosophy of life. And the peace movement, again, concretely deriving from that moral transformation of the whole people. And I mean, this is not as much related to the peace concert or the programming, but to why we think that, you know, the struggle for peace, first of all, has something to do with Afro-Asiatic values, but then also this idea you're saying about poetry and music and culture being an important part of the path towards peace movement right now, because I think it's related to this question of a new kind of human being the demand of this time, and the fact that that requires a new basis for culture that draws upon certain civilization values. But I don't know if I'm, yeah.
Well, I think I feel more and more strongly that the cultural aspect of like our political events is very important. Because I think we're developing an increasingly like dialectical relationship with these artists who, I mean, even this formulation of like Afro-Asiatic peace concert is I know that we will develop that further, but the way that I'm interpreting it to an extent is that if, like Baldwin says, the artist or the poet or the bard is the mirror for like the life, like the social life, the interior life, the civilization, then I feel like part of what we're saying is that the American people are not a white European people. They're actually they're civilizational people. They're an Afro-Asiatic people. Much, you know, that might come much closer to describing the essence of the American people than white, Western, European. And then I think the peace element is like the futuristic aspect to me is like logically what that union or what this revelation would mean. It extends you into a new type of relationship with the world. But I say this because like I think I've underestimated to an extent how difficult it is to be an American artist right now, because the ideas are not clear and also the consciousness of like the audiences is very low. And so I think artists who by definition inherit a futuristic function have not really been able to execute it. And that's what makes something like a relationship with free school or even a free school audience invaluable, especially for, let's say, something like a jazz musician. Because we know what it comes from, but also where it goes. And I think the jazz musician depends on like his or her audience. And so I think the way we continue to develop our framing of this is highly consequential. And yeah, there's just something I feel very convinced about, you know, how all of this belongs. I see this as it's going to be revelatory to us and the artists and the people. Like, you know, we're trying to locate something about the character again, of the revolutionary process moving forward. Yeah.
Oh yeah, one thing about the poet quote is that reminding what you said is Raju explained to me this is because I really should like read other philosophy, but Raju explained that actually Baldwin's reference, and this is also in some ways the genius of Baldwin, how smart this guy is, how well read he is. Like there's a reason why he refers to Dostoevsky. But that the quote about the poet, that's not the statesman or the union leader. It comes from from Plato, where Plato said the opposite. Plato was like, the poet is not important. Yeah, Plato said the opposite. That's what Roger said. I haven't gone to the source, but I'm pretty sure Plato says it's not the poet that makes the difference for the future of civilization. And then Baldwin takes the opposite stance, which is the poet is perhaps the most important. And I'm sorry if I'm misquoting Raju and Plato, but yeah, I think it's important because also this thing of the Afro-Asiatic, because we had this long conversation about that we don't want to say intercivilizational concept anymore. We're not really talking about civilizations like for us, we're not trying to. We're at a moment where it's not really just about like multiple civilizations together, which is obviously true, like right, single garment of destiny. But what we're trying to say is that, like King's pilgrimage to nonviolence, something about the Black freedom struggle is the same, guided by the same human principles: search for truth, search for love. Love is a sort of heals. That is something not foreign to African or Asian civilizations, but it's exactly like the kernel or root that was deliberately meant to be destroyed by the ideology of white supremacy. And but it's exactly the thing that African Americans held on to, preserved for all Americans in this country. And it's almost like, and it's also, to me, like it's very emotional to think about like John Coltrane and I guess you could say, I'm not as well versed, but like John Coltrane and Farrah Sanders, or even the visual artists like Aaron Douglas, who all are reaching for the world. They're all reaching for Asia and they're reaching for Africa, and it's because they're saying, I see myself as part of humanity. I belong with humanity. I don't want to be something in of myself, separated from humanity. Freedom is to be with humanity. For humanity, in my struggle for freedom, is to free humanity. Like there's something like that like there's a certain spirit that there's a lot that can be done, I think, in this Afro-Asiatic peace concept. And it's what Baldwin, I think it's really what Baldwin is saying, where he says, we are the strongest of the Western nations, not for the reasons that we think. It's because it's we, America, who's not European, like Michelle was saying. It's we, America, because of the Black proletariat, because we brought enslaved Africans here who held on to something that we deliberately tried to destroy. That's like, it's this thing of like Baldwin saying, like it's we America who can finally get rid of the old world concepts of race and caste and class and actually fulfill what we must have been saying when we said the New World.
See, this is very important what you're saying, to situate the Afro-Asiatic majoritarian movement in the heart of the U.S. empire, which is committed to destroying this majoritarian movement on the planet. And it's very important. And I think for the reasons that you gave, we wanted to go from the intercivilizational to the Afro-Asiatic concept, which gives it a stronger political grounding in the Bandung movement, the anti-colonial movements, and of course today, China, of course, as this, blase, blase, blah. But also with, so we celebrate Baldwin in the spirit of the Afro-Asiatic people's movement. That he was a part of this. And this is what we're going to try to bring out in the documentary. I'm overwhelmed with accent because I'm trying to write a script. But anyway, this year is James Arthur Baldwin, God, Revolutionary Voice. And weakness in what we have done thus far is we have not explained to the people who've come to various events, to reading groups, why Baldwin is a revolutionary. And in the period of postmodernism, everything is revolutionary, which means nothing is revolutionary then. So we want to do that, but we want to have this music. If the Foti family can come, it'll be a great contribution. And we talked to the father. He's very, positive towards us. I got the email back here from him. But this is an extraordinary family of Palestinians who are committed to the Palestinian cause. Oh, by the way, we cannot lose in this celebration of Baldwin's birthday that the whole year is dedicated to the immortal child of Gaza. We can't lose that. This is uppermost. We have to find ways to promote it and to shout it. That this is not just, Michelle, this is not just a concert for musicians to just come and play and entertain. This is art. And it's art in the Afro-Asiatic, very much like you wrote about, Kathy, with Archie Shepp, and free jazz communism. We have to find a way to kind of bring all of these things that people have written about to the fore in this period, I don't know how we do it, but we can think about it. But I think when we talk to Bobby, when we talk to Alfie, whoever else we talk to, we have to emphasize that we are celebrating Baldwin as a part of a movement of modern humanity towards freedom, something like that. The other thing, I don't know how the exhibit is coming along, but along with Aaron Douglas and Jacob Lawrence and all of that, we have to talk about, Serafina's art, Barbara Bullock's art. In fact, I got some pieces that we could include, Michael Clemens perhaps, that it could be a part of an exhibit celebrating Baldwin, So I would just like to say, but this exhibit at the Art Museum, at the Free Library, which is just as good as the Art Museum, we hope to have, and Mr. Foti told me about, he says, well, we have a dance group, and it's possible for the dance group to come on the 6th. And, his daughter, who's an opera singer and very accomplished, could be a revelation to so many people. So I would say yes. And I think being here in this church, we have to think about how to put it together so we can get as many people in here as possible. I think this is an extraordinary place for music and for jazz. You know, a good place for them to play, you know, with a tall ceiling and, you know, just gives them what they need, the space they need, you know. Don't you think?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's what I want to say. And so we have, this is what, the sixth or the fifth?
The third.
No, the day is, what's today? No, what is the day is the sixth. So count the days that we have left.
Yeah.
So every day we have to, you know, be on our.
Exactly
Yeah.
1 month.
So we don't have like a lot of time.
We have time.
We do
Yes.
have time. Time is on our side. So that's all I wanted to say. We just have to really work hard. We have to mobilize all the reading groups. We have to mobilize everybody that we touch for this. What we found out, you know, in the Wooden Shoe reading group, and I think to a certain extent in the Making Worlds reading group, that flyering and postering can make a difference. People do see flyers and posters and do come to things when they see them. And you know, we should also look forward, asking, for example, Robert at Mother Bethel, if we could have some leaflets and people could give them out at Zion, at the Unitarians. You know, I don't know. Well, some people go to their meetings. You know, you have to get in touch with Nate and Jewish Voices for Peace. See if he could distribute some leaflets or get some people from there. Samir, the Palestinian Coalition. Everybody should find a way to take part of celebrating Baldwin. And I think the argument, see, the thing is, and this is in moral questions, you don't have an option. There's only one option, and that is to do the moral thing or get off the stage of history and stop perpetrating a fraud. You understand what I'm saying? And that's, you know, that's where I feel about what we're doing, and especially Baldwin. You know, if you don't understand what this is, shut up. If you know what I could use curse words, but you know, because it is, it reaches a point where the moral questions are so clear, where Baldwin's role, if you don't know it all, it's clear in some, and don't act like you're going to boycott it because it's a Saturday free school. You know, and we know what that looks like and we know what that is in this city, but we have to be clear about it, etc. But I think we should push hard, push passionately, make our case wherever we are. We have to, and I think in our organizing group, we're going to have to start. We should make lists of people we have to reach out to. Nate Kleinman, very important. Whoever's still around from the encampment at Penn, whoever's still around from a Lotus Reading Group, and every reading group, which is, these are great mechanisms for mobilizing people. But we have to talk about Zion. We have to talk about Mother Bethel, you know, and well, of course, Mosque 12, please. And they all have to be here. That's all I wanted to say. But no, I haven't. Let's talk about that. I don't want to go and plead you. Yeah. But in terms of the exhibit, you know, if I got some Barbara Bullock, you know.
Oh, wow.
That's actually
At the library, that's what I'm doing.
We were
And
like,
let me
how do
ask
we-
you, during the Afro-Asiatic concert, do you think we could bring the exhibit over here to display
Some
it
of
with
it.
the pictures?
Some of it.
Huh?
Part of it.
Part of it.
Yeah.
Okay, part of it, yeah.
Yeah. It should be.
Yeah. Oh, yep.
Whatever I have.
Right.
Like,
We don't even have to sign a loan agreement to borrow this. We don't even need to get insurance. We just have good
Yeah, I do
faith. We
need
can.
insurance, but anyway, we'll bring
Yes.
it over here.
Yeah.
The artists still stay together.
You know,
With art I helped you fix. It's
Yeah,
still
it's yeah.
Wow.
Oh no, it stayed together.
Oh wait, somebody is missing a cake. I clearly haven't. Yeah.
yeah.
We can make the cake. Okay. You want to tag team?
No.
The exhibit will give updates on the exhibit in the latest.
Yeah, it's underway.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, is there anything else? Oh, well, there's one comment by Fire. Off topic. Can anyone explain to me Baldwin's use of the word scar in the rock pile? That's one of Baldwin's short stories. And Going to Meet the Man. It's the first one. Actually, what's interesting is rock pile is based on characters from Go Tell on the Mountain.
Yeah, which are based on his own life, like him, an older brother, a kind of reckless younger brother, growing up in Harlem. Yeah, playing, sometimes getting hurt, hurting each other, but then also seeing their family interact. That's all I know.
Yeah, I don't remember the words for now.
But I think there is an injury, and then something happens to the younger brother, and there's a scar, physical scar, but then maybe there's something internal. I haven't read it in a while, but you can ask.
Well, it might help if you read Fireplay, Go Tell on the Mountain, because the scar, I think, in Go Tell on the Mountain symbolizes something specifically.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, maybe we can end early. Since there's so much to do. So we can accomplish more. Yeah. But okay, thanks to all our commenters. We really appreciate their participation, and thanks to everyone who came to preschool in the room. And we'll see you all.
Right.
Okay, bye.